Hi. Hi, everyone online. I hope you're all suitably caffeinated as we move into the second session of our day. So we're moving from the sensorial to the material. So I'm very excited to introduce our second session, which is on materiality and resistance. And I will be graciously serving as the moderator of this session. First up, we'll hear from Julia Carabatsos, who is a third-year PhD student in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia, who will be talking about Ocean Gems, Paper Seas, Preserving Seaweed in the 19th-Century Album. And before I welcome Julia, just a note that we will be taking questions again at the end, as we did before. And if folks want to come up to the microphones that we have on either side and form a line, that will make it easier for me to not have to run around to take your questions. So with that, please join me in welcoming Julia to the stage.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. So this is an album from the 1870s, today in the collection of the New York Public Library. Its pages were blank when a woman, presumably in New York City, purchased it. She chose to fill its expanses of 8 by 10-inch paper with preserved specimens of seaweed. On each spread, tendrils of seaweed twist and unfurl. Each page also features a Linnaean classification alongside a location and date of collection. Here, you'll see seaweed culled from the shores of Brooklyn's Fort Hamilton in August 1874, while other parts of the album pencil in West Coast destinations like Santa Cruz, visited in November 1873. Some spreads invite comparisons among multiple samples. The maker worked within a palette of pinks, greens, reds, and browns, and often resorted to an upright composition. This kind of album, in which makers collected, arranged, and preserved seaweed, was a popular form in the 19th century, particularly for middle-class women in the UK and the Northeast United States. Alongside scientific conventions, the Linnaean classifications, the compositions adapted from standards of botanical illustration, makers conjured unseen underwater habitats, pointing to these volumes' individual imaginative significance beyond their broad classifying principles drawn from natural history. Unlike the limited existing literature on seaweed albums, my conclusions depend on my own engagement with this requisite treatment of slippery, slimy specimens. My approach draws from period instructional literature and from my own extensive practical experience experimenting with such methods to produce pressed seaweed sheets. Through this focus on manufacture, I will demonstrate how seaweed albums marked and promoted women's increasing mobility in the period, testaments of travel and brushes with danger, rather than solely practices of domesticity. Seaweed promised a sense of exploration that matched the imaginative potential of an album's blank pages. Of course, seaweed had been the subject of botanical inquiry, for example, in Anna Atkins's Photographs of British Algae of the early 1850s. And as a brief clarification, I'll note that in the 19th century, the word algae was a synonym for seaweed, as were more expressive phrases like sea moss and sea flower. And back to Atkins. In the preface of her volume of cyanotypes, she stresses her desire for accuracy, made possible by such impressions, as she calls them, of her specimens, as well as her intention for a scholarly audience. Popular seaweed guidebooks, by contrast, took a more poetic tone and positioned themselves against period discourses of science. For instance, in the Seaweed Collector, an 1872 manual of preservation and guidebook of British seaweed varieties, James Shirley Hibbard articulates the allure of this material. He writes, quote, "The flowers of the field and the mosses of the moor are accessible to many, but the vegetation of the sea is, for the most part, hidden as the contents of a sealed book, and we must pierce an unaccustomed element to discover how vast a world of life it nourishes and jealously hides in its bosom," end quote. Through his analogy to the codex form, Hibbard elides bound pages in underwater environments. Other writers, too, suggest how books and oceans might share a common element of mystery. Louisa Lane Clark, in her 1865 book, The Common Seaweeds of the British Coast and Channel Islands, describes encounters with, quote, "the coast anywhere as a book, opening and closing as the great sea ebbs and flows," end quote. Hibbard also attends to discourses tinged with religious sentiment about the beauty and diversity of godly creation and the wondrous variety of forms up for inspection. In turn, he laments the fact that, quote, "We shall have to display to our reader the paltry pedantries that science makes alliance with, and disfigure our cabinet of seaweeds by inscribing everywhere upon it such repulsive technicalities as Phycophyscus tuberculatus, Atractophoria hyponides, and Maugeria wormskioldea," end quote. And I probably mangled the pronunciation of those, but I'm sure Hibbard would not mind because, of course, these are the unattractive necessities of science that he begrudgingly instructs readers to append to their otherwise inspiring and attractive seaweed collections. In any case, there are other period instruction. All of these period instruction manuals emphasize how characteristics of limited access and secrecy, of imagination and poetry, made seaweed an ideal subject for the creative process of album making. I'm now showing a selection of pages from a mid-19th century album that embraces this potential for flair. Bows, swirls, composite samples, all of these compositions take up Louisa Lane Clark's stated purpose of directing readers in what she calls a, quote, unscientific process. Here, seaweed takes on fantastical connotations. These pages also speak to the gendered connotations of album making. Much of the instructional literature explicitly defines its product as, quote, a ladies' album, or in other words, books intended not really to intervene in cutting-edge botany. Though I will note that, of course, exceptions exist, including the work of the British phycologist or algae studier Amelia Griffiths. Much of the period literature on seaweed discusses strategies for creating preserved seaweed sheets, but existing scholarship on seaweed albums does not focus on manufacturing. And early on in my research to fill this gap, I decided to kind of try to reconstruct the 19th century methods that I was reading about and see what I could glean from hands-on experience with these techniques. And here I will note that I was drawing on the pedagogy of Ned Cook, who in his courses, I learned about ceramics by trying my hands at making pots and about furniture by testing out woodworking techniques. So to make a seaweed album, here are the steps. First, collect the seaweed. But in order to do that, makers needed to get to the shore. This map represents the sites of collection of the seaweed in the New York Public Library album. Many of the samples came from local waters. The examples are clustered around New York City, in New York Harbor, Rockaway Beach, and Glen Cove on Long Island. Yet you'll notice that the maker also spent weeks in Cape Ann, Massachusetts, and in Santa Cruz, California. The album even features samples from Portugal, England, and Australia, the last of which underscores the capacity of a seaweed album to participate in Britain's colonial ambitions. Collecting seaweed in locations local and international depended on the expansion of train and boat travel, particularly for tourism, both of which were well underway by the album's 1870s date of creation. Trains to beaches in New England, in particular, transformed oceanside sites into weekend getaway destinations. Ocean liners made trips to the US and Europe and between a glamorous travel experience. Once makers arrived at the shoreline, Clark details, they could collect seaweed from a range of mini habitats like tide pools or the low tide mark. Yet the most fruitful site of collection, she writes, is the beach during a storm, when the fierce waves turn the rarest species of seaweed from the depths and deposit them into the contact zone between water and land. Clark encourages her readers to, quote, stand a while by the seaside whilst the gale is whistling and the stoutest bark is tossing like a toy upon the ocean, while the wail of the sea and the drift of the shingle mingle with its thunder voice, stand and think, end quote. Here, in danger, overcome by nature, makers feel the drama and the peril of the littoral. I also took to the seaside after a storm to collect my seaweed, and I traveled not by train or ocean liner, but by car for some 21st century efficiency. My two primary sites of collection are indicated on the map, York Harbor Beach in Maine and Horseneck Beach in Massachusetts. I amassed groups of samples in jars of seawater and then rinsed them in water. On my first try, I will note, I waited too long to make the pressed seaweed sheets, and the samples began to smell extremely horribly. This very unsavory detail, which is of course left out of the very proper Victorian manuals, alerted me to the time sensitivity of seaweed album making. Indeed, Clark and others instruct readers to collect a small enough quantity of seaweed at one time to work in a timely fashion. What I didn't know before I experimented myself was this very smelly reason underpinning Clark's advice. But what's more, this experimental realization underscores the fact that the process of album making happened on the road. Hibbard discusses the compact, portable equipment required: a jar, a sheet of paper, a pair of scissors. He even writes that seaweed samples can be mounted not on full sheets of paper, but rather on the back of a letter or a loose page of a book. In other words, the materials one might find lying around in a hotel or in one's luggage. Even the dimensions of Hibbard's manual are relatively compact, so the book instructing how to make seaweed albums can be slipped into a suitcase or in a pocket for reference while traveling. Once the samples are clean, the maker selects a sample on a substrate and fills a shallow vessel, like a basin or a pie plate, with water. The maker submerges both components, which allows the seaweed to unfurl as it would when it's floating in the ocean. While the maker must, of course, twist and turn the samples, I found actually that the currents within the basin also kind of determined the composition. In this way, the form of the sample on the page matches the form of seaweed floating in water. And also, because the seaweed is so sticky, it sticks to the page, in fact, so there's no glue involved at all in this process. So you can see here a sample that I made, and then kind of the way that that composition reflects the way that seaweed might look when it's floating in the water. So again, as with the metaphorical language that I discussed earlier that was linking books and bodies of water, the page becomes a kind of sea or ocean for the seaweed sample. So next, the maker slips the sheet out of the basin and can make small adjustments to the composition with a tool like a stylist. Next, the maker leaves the pages to dry for a few hours before pressing them in a portable wooden frame press. After a few weeks, the waterlogged sheets are dry and can be annotated and added to an album. And on the screen now, you'll see some of my work. Some scholars have characterized seaweed albums as a means of domesticating nature, so to speak, that albums allowed women to collect and frame their specimens within a decorous, organized structure executed within the space of the home. While seaweed albums may have ended up in parlors, what I have stressed is the impossibility of their being assembled there, and in fact, the necessity of their creation away from the home, perhaps even in perilous circumstances. As such, I understand seaweed albums as a means of asserting women's travel and their presence along the shore. The markers of place and of collection in the New York Public Library album may align with scientific practices of documenting sample collection information, but they are also attestations of the maker's presence at local and far-flung seaside destinations. Hibbert writes to this effect when he notes that, quote, "To gather seaweeds, we must make acquaintance with the sea. And when we come to mount our specimens, we shall be reminded by them of pleasant days upon the sunny shore, of jovial boating expeditions, of dangers we have encountered and escaped, and of the deep impressions that the sea has made upon our minds and hearts by its vastness, changeableness, and inexhaustible wealth of life and beauty," end quote. In turn, seaweed album making could further allow for women's mobility through its status as an acceptable activity, a reason why they might journey to the beach and scour the shore. Far from a solely domestic pastime, this practice, as I've argued today, encouraged women to chase storms and document their experiences of the littoral. Thank you.
I'm so excited for this session, everyone. It's just getting better and better as it goes. Okay, great. Next, we have Ellery Foutch, awesome, who is associate professor in the American Studies program at Middlebury College in Vermont, in case you didn't know where Middlebury was. It's a great place. Ellery will be talking about sculpting plant life, stopping time, the Blaschkas botanical models at Harvard. And I promise we're going to move on from botanicals very soon. So Ellery, come on up.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited about the topic of this conference, and the papers on the program look so thrilling. Really happy to be here today. And as this is a conference about labor and materiality in some ways, I think it's especially important to thank those whose expertise and labor make the material conditions of our projects possible. So first, to thank Adrianna and Adrianna Link and Thomas Johns for making this all happen. And I also need to thank the archivists at the Corning Museum of Glass and at Harvard's University Herbaria and Botany Libraries, especially Lisa De Cesare, and also to the former keeper of the glass flowers, Susan Rossi Wilcox, and current collections manager, Jennifer Brown. So as Adrianna said, today I'll be speaking about the so-called glass flowers made by the German artists Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka, commissioned by Harvard University and underwritten by Boston patrons Elizabeth and Mary Lee Ware, a 50-year collaboration spanning 1887 to 1937. This work is part of a larger project on 19th century ideas about perfection and its preservation, what I think of as a desire to stop time at a perfect moment, preventing change or decay and transforming the ephemeral into the eternal. This includes case studies on Titian Peele's butterfly projects, some of which are housed in this very building. Bodybuilder Eugene Sandow, who transformed his own physical mortal body into a sculpture. And as I'll be speaking about today, amazingly illusionistic flowers that never wilt or fade. Switching my letters, my constants. Beyond their accurate and convincing appearances, these models prompted viewers to ponder issues of permanence and fragility, transparency and illusion. Both the models and their corresponding archive, thousands of letters between artists and patrons over a partnership spanning some 50 years, threatened to overwhelm viewers and scholars with their scope and detail. But first things first. The glass flowers were not merely meant to replicate or reproduce nature, but rather to substitute for it altogether, at least within the walls of the Natural History Museum or the classroom. And this is an important departure from other fields of natural history. Whereas most objects in these museums have an immediately visible physical tie to the natural world, the bones of a skeleton, minerals that have been extracted from the earth, seashells, pinned insects, the skins of mammals that have been mounted onto taxidermy specimens, or for that matter, pages of seaweed, as we've seen, botany professors found themselves in a quandary. Actual plant products looked very little like living plants and also had very little visual appeal. One Harvard professor described the original Museum of Vegetable Products, started by Asa Gray in the 1850s, as, quote, an affair of wood samples, pods, cones, nuts, burls, palm trunks, and the like, a valuable aid to instruction, but little suited to public exhibition. Given Cambridge's long and harsh winters, Harvard's Botanic Garden and Arboretum were uninhabitable or in hibernation for large parts of the year, making the use of living plants untenable. Even in temperate weather, when they were in bloom, unruly visitors posed problems, picking flowers and making a bouquet from the exhibition material, or picking up labels to read them more closely, only to replace those labels in front of different plants, as can be found in numerous plaintive reports from the professors to the annual reports of their director. So botanical study in the 19th century had established a tradition of teaching from constructed models rather than the plants themselves. And I'm showing you some of those transformed plant-like material or plant material. Wax models, for example, were widely used in botanical collections. And here we see an example by the Minturn family from Kew Gardens. But they were seen as unacceptable to Harvard professors, appearing, quote, like the cheerless elements of funereal reeds, as he once described them, decidedly non-scientific and perhaps even emotionally loaded. And I should also say that the Minturns, in addition to making scientific models, published books of instruction in fancy work for women to create wax botanical bouquets or models, less scientifically speaking, in their parlors, kind of like the fancy work that Julie just spoke about. Paper mache models were also a popular choice, as you can see here, used in many university classrooms, but a lot of the Harvard professors dismissed their enlarged forms as exaggerated and grotesque. And you can get an idea of their scale of degree of abstraction or simplification, I think, in some of these images. These are by Robert and Reinhold Brindel, Germans, or the French studio of Auzou. They abstract the flower, distilling it down to its essential characteristics and eliminating distracting details. And some models even have mechanisms for dissecting the plants, often by means of hooks and latches, as you can see here. And I can imagine this wouldn't give students a very good idea of what dissecting an actual plant with a scalpel would be like with this helpfully labeled material. German glassworkers Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka had become renowned for their detailed and illusionistic models of hard-to-depict marine invertebrates, made in their home studio on the outskirts of Dresden and displayed in natural history museums and classrooms worldwide, not only in the US and Europe, but also in Japan and India. Funding came from Bostonian Mary Lee Ware and her mother Elizabeth, who were looking for a suitable memorial for recently deceased Charles Eliot Ware, Harvard class of 1834. And I point out these connections not only to outline the system of commission, patronage, and international exchange inherent in the creation of the glass flowers, but also because these far-flung relationships built an incredible archive. Because these key figures were often not in the same town or even in the same country, they had to make arrangements by letters, committing their thoughts, goals, and ideas to paper. What would otherwise be fleeting conversations about the project at hand or small talk observations about the changing seasons, natural phenomena, or aging have been recorded in an amazing archive kept for posterity, one that also threatens to overwhelm scholars with its vast scope. So this partnership between Harvard, the Blaschkas, and the Wares lasted from 1887 until 1937. As I've said, nearly 50 years of collaboration and exchange, and ultimately a collection of over 4,000 models, 850 of which are depicted at life size. The collection is nearly overwhelming in scope and in detail. As one visitor to the collection enthused, quote, "One could spend days in those rooms and then not see half that there is to be seen." Faced with case after case of excruciatingly exact models, the mind reels, and I speak from personal experience. As an 1897 article about the models noted, quote, "As in nature, no two flowers or leaves of a single plant are exactly the same. So in the glass reproduction, every infinitesimal variation is rendered with a fidelity which is almost painful." This notion of pain, suffering, and sacrifice juxtaposed with wonder suffuses many of the responses of the time to the glass flowers. So while many people usually think of the glass flowers as these life-size models, each model was and still is displayed with several enlarged details, magnified cross-sections of plant anatomy, enlarged details of the reproductive systems. Let's see, I can go back. Enlarged details of the reproductive systems and various representations of dissected details. These were important. Harvard purchased a new microscope and reversing prism to assist the Blaschkas in this microscopic work. So they really prioritized this work and not just those life-size illusionistic ones. The resulting models imitate the natural world with trompe-l'oeil exactitude, while slivers of glass representing the magnified cross-sections render the microscopic world in rational, ordered forms, as familiar as a thin slice of cucumber. Much of the reception of the glass flowers adheres to the conventions of trompe-l'oeil works, in which viewers invoke expectations that the flowers will smell, that grains of pollen will drop from the blooms, that bees will invade the gallery in frustration. Glass, usually prized for its translucency and transparency, has been transformed by the Blaschkas into any number of colors, textures, and shapes, ultimately disguising its own materiality and rendering itself nearly opaque to today's viewers. So successfully does it imitate the sharp edge of a cactus spine, the velvety softness of a petal. In a culture that was painfully aware of the accelerated pace of modern life, the glass flowers promised a slower, contemplative path, one in which even the passing of the seasons was suspended by the model's insistent stasis. By bringing together plants from different parts of the globe and portraying them all in full bloom, the Botanical Museum collapsed traditional boundaries of time and space, juxtaposing plants that bloomed in different seasons, species from different regions and climates, and even two different moments in the life of one species, as in the case of a maple branch, which is sown both with the crimson red of autumn and the lush green of summer. The contrast between the timescales of nature, quickly fading blossoms or rapidly growing species, and those of human labor in glassmaking or in harvesting or manufacturing natural products were on display both in the museum and in the Blaschkas correspondence. And this is an installation view of the Harvard Natural History Museum as it appears today. You can see one of the Blaschkas glassworking tables or lampworking tables in that vitrine in the foreground, and the cases of display behind them. The Blaschkas were also concerned that people would assume that what could go quickly in nature could also be created quickly in the studio. In one letter they wrote, "With such a very common matter as grass, which nature produces in so great abundance, there could easily be thought by those who never saw the process of making these models, the latter could likewise grow as fast as in nature, while just the sprays of grass in flower contains the hardest nuts to crack." Paradoxically, fast-growing plants like grasses were more difficult and took more time to represent than presumably more complicated flowers, a situation the Blaschkas referred to as ungrateful work, comparing the skill presumed in rendering a showy plant. All of this was accomplished with very rudimentary tools, as you might have seen. A paraffin flame, pliers, pinchers, rods and tubes of glass, and clumps of glass cullet. These tools are enshrined in many of the exhibits of their work today. One of the Blaschkas tables is displayed in a vitrine, as I mentioned, at Harvard. And you're also seeing, whoops, I got so ahead of myself. This was so exciting. And they're also displayed here in a previous exhibit at Corning, in which they really juxtapose the crude, almost rusty nature of the tools with these really delicate models. The rods and tubes of glass would have been heated over a flame and then pulled and pinched into shape. This fascination extends to institutions that don't even own Blaschka tools. In a somewhat over-the-top diorama I have only seen online in Geneva's Natural History Museum with a wax figure, I guess, a model of kinds of Leopold at his workbench. And I thought of this as a somewhat entertaining diversion, but reviews of Leopold's 1863 exhibition at the Dresden Botanical Garden indicate that the artist himself was on display with his models at the Botanical Gardens, creating bouquets of violets or roses as astonished viewers watched, with especially gorgeous orchids. And I love that he was actually in the Botanical Gardens in this setting with real blooming flowers and glass houses of actual flowers, creating these works from almost a magical appearance. Reviews parallel the quick metamorphosis of glass into flowers with the unfurling of the leaves of the Victoria Regia water lily, then on display nearby, whose leaves unfurled and transformed from an almost hedgehog-like form to the vast expanse of the open water lily. The handmade status lends the models both a sense of wonder. How can human hands create such a marvelous imitation of nature? And a sense of suspicion at their fidelity. Harvard botany professor Walter Dean told of examining the glass models under a magnifying lens and a microscope, attempting to find any evidence of deviance from nature. I've been pushing the back button and I need to push the forward button. There we go. Hello, okay. So Walter Dean looked at these under a microscope and recorded his observations, which were then reprinted in almost every subsequent article about the glass flowers. What he wrote is an almost mind-numbing account of the model's fidelity to the natural world in excruciating detail, describing the appearance of ovaries, numbers of stamens, filaments, and the like. Eventually, he concludes there is such rigid observance of the very minutest features that we can be absolutely sure that every model is an exact copy of the fresh specimen which the artist had in hand. Even beyond their appearances to the naked eye, Dean asserted, the accuracy of the models held, even when examined under a magnifying lens, with parts of the model usually not visible to viewers. He described, quote, a complex inflorescence with its multitudinous minute flowers almost past belief. In its clusters, with its flowers so small that their structure can be seen only with a lens, I counted of buds, blossoms, and developing fruit from 2,500 to 3,000. And yet every flower has its 5 petals and 5 alternating stamens with long filaments. I sought to find on the underpart of the cluster some flowers perhaps less carefully done, as being practically out of sight, but they were all equal in their perfection." End quote. This careful act of copying and representation maintained the variability of nature's forms, taking no shortcuts. One reviewer observed, quote, "As in nature, no 2 flowers or leaves of a single plant are exactly the same. So in the glass reproduction, every minute variation is followed with the greatest fidelity." And I think too, this use of artificiality or reproduction or copy is really significant. While Walter Dean's observations of models under magnification impressed him with their thoroughness, he was also shocked by this variability. Every flower has its separate pattern. They are not all cast in one mold. And this interest in and emphasis upon the variations of nature highlights the glass flower's differences from wax models on display in other museums, such as those at the American Museum of Natural History, which prioritized and publicized the use of actual plants or plant parts, emphasizing a physical link to the living form. The AMNH staff publicized the processes of model making, inviting visitors to view the model making studio and publishing articles, as seen here, that outline the step-by-step procedures followed in making their models and the molds, as seen in the text and illustrations provided to demonstrate how the wax models were made. Model makers emphasized the indexical relationship between the model and a real plant, with molds made from actual leaves, giving the plants a closer relationship to nature. As they wrote, quote, "These reproductions are all prepared direct from natural specimens, and whenever possible, the natural object itself has been preserved and utilized in the model." Not only were wax leaves created using molds cast from actual leaves affixed to original branches, but in constructing the model of a cactus, this blew my mind, the actual spines were removed from the plant and inserted into the wax form, as you can see in the caption here. In reproducing a cactus, the spines must be removed and replaced in their proper position on the wax cast. This evokes its own dazzling amount of labor as well, of course. Plant time and human laboring time were also juxtaposed in the Botanical Museum's economic botany displays, highlighting the goods that could be produced or derived from plants, from foodstuffs to textiles to medicine, and therefore the significance of botany and systems of global capital. And we might even say that some of these display cases, some of the same display cases aesthetics existed not only in the Natural History Museum, but also in the department store, as seen here. And by the time these photographs of the economic botany galleries were taken in the 1930s, the consumer products had been separated from the glass models and installed in separate cases. But articles about the exhibition from the 1890s indicate the glass models were displayed side by side with these processed products. So I'll try to give us kind of an illusion of that here. An 1895 article for the Boston Commonwealth described, quote, "There are the glass models of the plant, the flower, the details of the latter, the cross sections of the seed. Then there are the flowers and seeds preserved in alcohol." Again, the thing itself with its representation. Then the commercial product, all the varieties known to the trade being shown. And last, the finished product, cocoa butter, chocolate, breakfast chocolate. Some of the most frequently discussed plants in these economic displays actually are ones that have been associated with the American continents since contact, such as cocoa, cacao, tobacco, corn, and cotton, further emphasizing the linkages between plants and histories of colonialism, empire, enslaved labor, and global capitalism. Harvard professor Oakes Ames had argued that economic botany could revivify the relevance, so-called relevance, of the exhibition to early 20th century audiences interested in commerce, marketing, or economics. Relevance isn't just our marketing departments now. As Ames mused, research in economic botany is sufficiently important, this is a quote, "sufficiently important in our daily life to take up 9/10 of the advertising space on the streetcars. From cadum ointment to Quincy cigars, economic botany flashes its importance from advertisements everywhere." By demonstrating the economic usefulness of plants, this display invoked the historical resonance and significance of plants and plant products beyond the scope of botany and into the realms of wealth, power, and subjugation. Yet it also collapsed and conflated the raw materials with their finished commercial products, erasing not only the human and industrial labor that transformed and packaged these products, but also the time required for the growth, harvesting, and processing. The viewers are simply presented with two moments in the plant's life: before the raw material and after the commercial product, not the gradual process of plant commodification. Although most aspects of the models and their exhibitions slowed the viewer's experience of time, suspending a fragile blossom for extended contemplation and an elongated life cycle, the practice of displaying the modeled representation of the plant and a packaged product side by side fast forwards and compresses time. Far from esoteric teaching models, the glass flowers became popular tourist attractions and cultural icons. Audiences marveled not only at their lifelikeliness and exactitude, but also at the poignancy of the collection and the tensions it raises about permanence and fragility, futility and morality, obsession and order. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellery. And I think yours and Julia's really kind of gets to the question of invisible labor that goes into the making of natural history, which is one of our key themes in this conference. So thank you both. So we're shifting gears now. If I can make this work. Did I do it? No. Whoa. This is a funny mouse up here. Okay. Very happy to introduce Kristoffer Whitney, who is Associate Professor of Science, Technology, and Society at the Rochester Institute of Technology. So finally, we're going to get to some ornithology now today. So his paper is Making Nature Accessible, Wallace, Craig, and the Wood PeWee. So Kristoffer, thank you.
Thank you to the organizers. I'm really happy to be included. Okay, I think I have everything. All right, this story centers Wallace Craig, a pioneering ethologist, one who studies animal psychology and behavior of the early to mid 20th century. Craig, acknowledged by his contemporaries and later historians of science as a groundbreaking investigator of the social and emotional lives of animals, has nevertheless, then and now, remained a marginal figure in the history of biology, largely due to his status as a late deafened researcher. This story also involves the eastern wood pewee, adorably pictured here, a small gray flycatcher with a common but distinctive call. Together, Craig and the PeWee offer an example of non-lethal collecting in natural history and a unique collaborative study of birdsong. More importantly, perhaps, the example of Craig's life and work is an opportunity to understand more clearly the historically rooted ableism embedded in our institutions of higher education, and the gains to be had in diversifying our perspectives on the natural world. More on that in a moment. First, a brief sketch of Wallace Craig's early career. Craig was born in 1876. He studied under the early ecologist Stephen Forbes at the University of Illinois before entering the University of Chicago in 1901. There, Craig worked under the famous zoologist Charles Otis Whitman on the vocal behaviors of doves and pigeons. Graduating with his Ph.D. in 1908, Craig took a position at the University of Maine, and this is his faculty photo from the archives at Maine. Though intellectually isolated and underfunded at Maine, Craig managed to do what, in retrospect, has been considered path-breaking work in the study of comparative psychology and animal instinct. His 1918 Appetites and Aversions as Constituents of Instincts has been referenced then and now as a fundamental and influential work in the study of animal behavior. However, Craig began having difficulties hearing and lecturing in the 1920s. As a result, he left Maine in 1922, though it's unclear whether he chose this himself, whether he was forced out, or perhaps a bit of both. He was brought on as a part-time lecturer at Harvard, but due to trouble with his auditory apparatus, the term he used, and I should mention that his correspondence about the wood pewee, his wood pewee project, is full of references to his hearing loss, as well as ads for different hearing aids he had tried. He moved from teaching to doing what would have been considered menial indexing work for a medical lab at Harvard. Despite underemployment and only intermittent institutional support, Craig continued to make his mark on ethology in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. His work on the Song of the Wood PeWee is a case in point. Craig devised a system of soliciting and collecting bird songs that allowed him to analyze vocalization patterns that he himself could no longer hear. Writing a request for data on the twilight song of the wood PeWee in the journal Science in 1926, as well as a more detailed corresponding piece in the Auk the same year, Craig laid out his plan. He suggested that the PeWee's twilight song, in particular, the song sung at sunrise rather than sunset, could be understood as consisting of 3 distinct musical phrases, which a dedicated and skilled listener could easily discern and transcribe. Importantly, the variation Craig was interested in was not in the phrases themselves, but in their arrangement over the entire course of a wood PeWee's song, how often they sang each phrase and in which order. Craig instructed any interested and willing person to get themselves in close proximity to one of the birds before sunrise, so 3 or 4 in the morning during the summer, and then jot down phrases 1, 2, and 3 in the order in which they heard them. The results generally looked like this. And this is one of his correspondents, Margaret Morse niece, writing, and you can see she's put the location, the date, and the time in the morning, 4:17, and then she starts marking down, oh, I've heard phrase 1, I've heard phrase 2, 1, 1, in that order over and over. With over 100 responses and 100,000 recorded phrases, Craig leveraged the interests of amateur ornithologists, friends, and colleagues to create an extensive network of wood PeWee listeners. Despite his marginal status and next to no resources, Craig, very slowly, over more than 15 years, assembled and analyzed these responses, finishing and publishing a 186-page monograph on the Song of the Wood PeWee in the New York State Museum Bulletin in 1943. This is the cover. He had moved to Albany, New York, to finish the paper at the behest of an old classmate, Charles Adams, who was the director of the New York State Museum at the time. And you can see Craig listed here as temporary ornithologist. The monograph was warmly received in a small handful of ornithological journals, but arguably made very little impact in the world of ethology, perhaps in part because of where it was published. What made this work remarkable, rather, was its scale and its methodology. As Craig himself noted in the introduction, as a result of this study, quote, "The wood PeWee is the only wild bird anywhere in the world whose song has been observed cooperatively and analyzed statistically to determine the order of succession of the phrases and hence the musical structure of the song." Of the many topics covered in the monograph, and you can see those listed here, the notion of birdsong as music, birds as composers, and the individual variations from bird to bird loomed large. Throughout his correspondence with PeWee recorders, Craig was constantly looking for, quote, genius birds, whose songs stood out as particularly different and inventive. Alerted to one such by his most important collaborator, the naturalist artist Saunders, Craig and he went back and forth about a PeWee they referred to as Saunders' Ninth, or sometimes Saunders' Genius. And this is, Saunders had his own unique way of diagramming birdsong, which was not musical notation or words, or even just the numbers for the phrases, but he would diagram them in these sort of swooping arcs with corresponding notes on the left, keys rather. So Saunders, sending this in and corresponding with Craig, insisted that his ninth PeWee was a, quote, a genius and a composer who was inventing new phrases and thus adding new beauty to his song. In his replies, both in correspondence and in the published monograph, Craig was more likely to hypothesize that the unique song of Saunders' Ninth was due to, quote, errors on the part of the bird as a result of its, quote, stammer. For Craig, however, this did not also mean that the bird wasn't a genius, but that its genius lay in its ability to sing using its stammer. As he wrote in the 1943 monograph, quote, the individual in question began his peculiar phrases unintentionally because he was stammering. But having got started on these new sounds, he did mold them into pleasing musical form and thus added new beauty to his song. I'll return to this in just a moment. Aside from the Wood PeWee monograph and a handful of other articles, the latter half of Craig's career was a struggle for employment and resources. The University of Maine would prove to be the first and only full-time academic employment of his career. He lectured part-time for 2 years at Harvard and then found menial odd jobs around the university into the 1930s. After briefly living in England and Scotland in the mid-30s, Craig was invited to the State Museum in Albany, as I just mentioned, to finally complete the manuscript. This was followed by a research affiliation back at Harvard in the mid-40s, during which time he cobbled together funding from the American Philosophical Society, actually, to work on what he hoped would be his magnum opus on animal perception and behavior, to be called, quote, a study of the space system of the perceiving self. Craig retired to Woods Hole, Massachusetts in the late 1940s and died ill and in obscurity in 1954. His final study was never completed, and the draft manuscript is lost to time, despite a lot of effort to find it. So, why study Wallace Craig and his Wood PeWee project? I will admit I'm at the very early stages of this project, but I want to suggest a few reasons why we should care. First, this is an example of natural history that goes beyond the collection of specimens to include non-lethal collection of data like birdsong, of which there are a growing number of examples in the historiography. Second, Craig is a good example of a scientist who is simultaneously marginal and deeply influential in his field, and whose work has nearly been forgotten. In his time, Craig's empirical and theoretical work with bird behavior garnered the attention of researchers like Margaret Morse-Niece, herself a woefully underregarded early ethologist, who in turn introduced Craig and his work to leading figures in ethology like the Austrian zoologist Konrad Lorenz. Lorenz, in fact, acknowledged the deep debt he owed to Craig and his ideas for his agenda-setting papers on animal behavior in the mid-1930s. And third, I see Craig's story as an opportunity to highlight some of the intersections between history of biology, disability history, and deaf studies. As scholars like Harry Lang have pointed out, the deaf experience deserves to be part of the history of science. Wallace Craig's life and work was undoubtedly shaped by his deafness, as he was considered unemployable as a traditional academic, including by himself. Furthermore, as Rachel Mundy first argued, Craig's own bodily difference and tenuous institutional status may have led to unique interpretations of animal behavior, as just discussed when he noted a genius wood PeWee that appeared to use its vocal stammer as a way to craft a more complicated song than was the norm among the species. That is, this PeWee was a genius not because of its innate musical ability, but because of its, in anthropomorphic terms, disability. On the basis of Craig's correspondence with his wood PeWee song recorders, I would, provisionally at least, be willing to go a little bit further. I would suggest that not only was Craig's interpretation of the beauty of to emerge from a stammer potentially a partial product of his own experience with disability, but so too was the entire conception and methodology of this PeWee study. Consider, for example, this excerpt of a letter from Craig to a Mr. Lewis O. Shelley on March 30th, 1927. He wrote, "Your letter and the letters of other observers inform me that there are many fine variations of the wood PeWee's phrases, which I am not familiar with. Unfortunately, I shall never be able to study all these fine variations because I am losing my hearing. But what I am studying at present is the arrangement of the three phrases in the Twilight Song. And I can continue this study from the records made by others, even if I become quite deaf myself." Craig's hearing loss led him not only assemble a unique network of song collectors, but to focus on the arrangement and creativity of the song itself, rather than the minutiae of the phrases, an approach that might not have occurred to him or others otherwise. This is potentially an example of what disability scholars and activists might today call deaf gain or disability gain. The unique perspectives produced by the lived experience of people with disabilities, which belie the deficit-based, ableist assumptions that dominate mainstream institutions. Wallace Craig suggests to me, therefore, that disability history has something to add to the history of natural history and biology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristoffer. I'm really looking forward to the discussion of this session. But before we get there, we have one more paper. So I'm very delighted to welcome Hadley Welch Jensen, who's Curator of Collections and Research at the Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian, to talk about crafting nature, reactivating Indigenous knowledge in Navajo die charts.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. And a special thanks to the conference organizers for all of their support. 4 sacred mountains delineate the homelands of the Dene, or Navajo, stretching across vast territories of present-day Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. According to creation stories, the Navajo emerged from the lower worlds into this region, which is known as Deneta, or among the people. It's the place where earth people and holy people interacted, and their relationships form the foundation of the cultural practices that sustain Navajo life today. Geologically speaking, the Navajo Nation is situated on the southwestern Colorado Plateau, with an area of over 27,000 square miles. As rendered by writer and conservationist Terry Tempest Williams, quote, "The Colorado Plateau is characterized by horizontal sedimentary formations, deeply incised drainage systems, aridity, and sparse vegetation," end quote. Volcanic activity, wind, and water erosion have carved its varied landscapes and shaped its topography, including Window Rock, Canyon de Chelly, Shiprock, and Monument Valley. Volcanic rocks spewed across the Colorado Plateau are reminiscent of eruptions during late Cenozoic time. Shallow intrusions of magma slowly worked their way to the surface. But as Williams notes, these rocks tell other stories as well. Today, I'd like to focus on one specific locality, the Oak Springs Pine Springs chapter in Arizona. Sitting high on the Defiance Plateau, south of Window Rock, this heavily wooded area consists of 2 communities separated by only 12 miles. The English place names indicate descriptions of water sources in each, but in Dene Bizad, the Navajo language, the towns were named for different plants. Pine Springs was originally known as Lone Cottonwood for a tree that used to stand behind the trading post, and Oak Springs was known as Cattails in a Row. An understanding of place is integral to interpreting a particular mode of representation that emerged from that landscape, the Navajo die chart. Despite its later circulation in a variety of cultural contexts, these artworks have served as a vital tool in the documentation of traditional ecological knowledge. Created in the 1950s by Mabel Burnside Myers, a Dene herbalist, sheep herder, and weaver, they were originally conceived as a guide to natural dye sources for younger weavers. Through their afterlives, these objects now provide an important material record of Indigenous knowledge about color, an aspect of Navajo weaving that's been overlooked in most academic studies. Through my ongoing research, I'm interested in exploring the production and later circulation of die charts, particularly as a way of preserving Indigenous knowledge about ecology and ethnobotany. Within these histories, I also emphasize their dual position as objects of intercultural innovation and as products of Native agency. Each die chart includes a miniature textile mounted on a vertical loom and centered against a wool background. A web-like constellation of colored yarn extends outward from the weaving, each strand corresponding to a sample of the dried plant used to make its dye. The largest one, pictured here on the left, displays 22 specimens, typically including rabbit brush, juniper root, sumac leaves, Navajo tea, mountain mahogany root, and sagebrush. While the framed composition includes a two-dimensional textile, it also incorporates text or descriptive captions for each dye plant, always written in English and sometimes translated into Navajo below. As such, die charts cannot be categorized as a work of visual art alone, but might be akin to a captioned photograph in a book or a miniaturized museum display, especially the kind found in natural history museums in the mid-20th century. A material expression of the Southwestern landscape, die charts provide a multi-sensory index of place. As the names of these communities imply, Pine and Oak Springs, the area is rich in timber, and Isabel Dischini, the daughter of Mabel Burnside Myers, uses locally sourced oak for her custom-built frames. The plants used for natural dye production are also dense in this area, including nearly 300 different species. While Dischini's mother originally devised these charts as a guide for her students, they were later reproduced for the tourist market and can still be found in gift shops and trading posts throughout the Southwest. Dischini was recently awarded Best of Show at the 2019 Nijoni Arts Market for her framed 3-foot by 6-foot vegetable dye chart. As the largest version in existence, it includes 78 dried plants, herbs, berries, and flowers, displayed alongside juniper ash for black and clay for white. The subtle hues evoke a sunset, reflecting Dischini's intentional use of color as a material rendering of topography. Dischini explains that some of her favorite colors come from the prickly pear cactus, which can yield a different shade depending on the time of year that the fruit is harvested. While her unusually large chart took only 2 months to create, she spent over 40 years collecting all the specimens for it. Since then, it was acquired by the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona, where it now serves as a reference for other weavers. Former museum director Manuelita Wheeler noted that they were honored to acquire the award-winning die chart for their permanent collection, reflecting that it's a beautiful, rare example of generations of Dene wisdom and knowledge. Die charts also describe the evolving body of knowledge that many Indigenous communities learn and pass down regarding the environment and the species that maintain relations with each other, including plants, animals, and humans. Guided by the protocols of traditional ecological knowledge, natural dye practitioners are careful to only harvest the plants they need. For example, a weaver does not pick dye plants if they aren't plentiful enough in certain locations or during certain seasons, typically April through October, to preserve a sustainable relationship with the land. Many weavers also talk to plants to ask their permission before collecting them and provide offerings in return. The reciprocal relationships in material gathering practices demonstrate the co-constructed nature of Navajo weaving, made visible by the ways that some Dene weavers communicate with and move through their environments. Just as many Athabascan identities are shaped by movement in a landscape, these processes reveal the construction of particular social identities through particular ways of moving. As archaeologists Severin Fowles and Sunday Isolt note, quote, rather than thinking about the landscape. Many Athabascans refer to the way their thoughts dwell in storied places. As a result, to move through such a landscape was to revisit, rehearse, and reaffirm the stories that grounded one's identity. End quote. While the focus of their study is on the Apache and Tiwa, I want to invoke this idea of being grounded within a landscape, which serves as a container for creation narratives, sacred ceremonies, and craft production. In a similar way, the Navajo die chart is a kind of container, a mental map or a landscape in miniature, carrying localized knowledge of these storied places. Die charts can be found in the collections of several regional museums in the Southwest, including the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the Indian Arts Research Center in Santa Fe, both of which hold some of the finest historic examples, including those by Dischini and her mother. It's interesting that die charts are absent from the permanent collections of most major art and natural history museums in the US and Europe. Due to their relatively late date of production in the mid-20th century, they may have escaped the particularly anthropological fetishization of the authentic native-made object that characterized salvage ethnography in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. More recently, there's been an emerging recognition of the agency of Indigenous actors in collecting and documenting anthropological, zoological, and botanical materials. This scholarship has highlighted the existence of pre-colonial Indigenous systems of land management, as well as its influence on the development of Euro-American scientific knowledge. Situated within current debates on decolonizing the practice and method of museum work, my work builds upon this re-emerging interest in Indigenous ecology and the value of ethnobotanical collections. I'll just briefly mention that I further developed this research through one of my recent curatorial projects, Shaped by the Loom, which opened at Bard Graduate Center Gallery in New York last spring. It was the first exhibition to showcase the American Museum of Natural History's collection of Indigenous textiles from the Southwest. Bringing together Danae weavers and visual artists with historical items from AM&H, it presents weaving as an art form, a cultural practice, and a lived experience. This project evolved from a desire to provide a new interpretive lens for viewing the historic Navajo textile collection at AM&H, largely acquired by anthropology curators in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The challenges and uncertainties created by the pandemic also prompted us to consider the advantages of an online platform, especially for accessibility, which could work in tandem with a physical display of these items. We decided to use the Navajo die chart as the conceptual framework, as well as the architecture for the site's homepage, creating connections among thematic sections and offering multiple pathways for navigating content. As we rethink what virtual and museum spaces can be, one of our priorities is to make this content and its documentation both accessible and relevant to Dene communities. To close, an analysis of die charts reveals the multiple layers of meaning embedded within this art form, which has now obtained a new kind of currency on the internet. I found this poster version of a die chart by Ella Myers on Pinterest, where it's marketed as a decorative item that would look fantastic hanging in a laundry room. While the entanglement of die charts within the economy of Southwestern tourism cannot be separated from this analysis, I suggest that we can't fully understand their significance without reconstructing the native histories surrounding their creation. Through the recovery of Indigenous agency in their production, die charts offer a means of situating weaving as a culturally grounded practice, as a way of knowing and dwelling in the landscape, and as a material representation of ecological worlds in the Southwest. Thank you.
But thank you all. This was such a fantastic session, and I think you can understand or begin to understand why we decided to pair your papers together. So I think following Pedro's model from the first session, I'd sort of like us to reflect a little bit on the title of the session, which is Materiality and Resistance. And I have kind of a two-part question. So on the one hand, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how the various material objects that each of you talk about in your presentations maybe resist more quote unquote traditional modes of collecting practice or natural history conventions in whatever time period it is that you're working about. And then another thing that really struck me in listening to you was really about this kind of experiential thread that cuts across all of your papers. So in addition to thinking about the resistance to natural history practice, I'd also love to hear you think about how materiality actually kind of obscures the experiential process that each of you is grappling with in your papers. So Julie, I don't know if you want to start, and then we'll go down the line and see who else has questions.
Okay, I think we're good. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. One of the things that I was thinking about throughout the panel was just kind of this idea of like the indexical relationship between a specimen and then the way it might be processed by artists or makers. And one of the things I was thinking about especially was the fact that, you know, we think that perhaps we're, you know, encountering this sample taken exactly from the place where it was collected. But what I found, I guess maybe this is kind of an answer to both of the questions at once, which is that what I found when I was trying out these techniques is the fact that actually, you know, there's a lot of culling and selecting that happens before the sample even gets to the place where the person is possibly making a seaweed album. And then even beyond that, a lot of the books I was reading were instructing makers to, you know, cut away branches that maybe look too confusing or are a little bit too, the composition would be too busy or something like that. And so that was kind of making me think about this fact that this idea that like we think that because the piece of seaweed is on the paper that we're experiencing this firsthand moment with the sea, but in fact, there are so many different layers in between that bring the sample to the thing that we find in the library. So that was my first thought.
Thanks. Yeah, what you were just evoking, Julia, reminded me of something I turn back to so often, which are Sue Ann Prince's words about specimens as being both more and less than the real thing. They're always mediated by human hands, even if they are presenting themselves as the real thing. And so I think that's maybe something that more broadly I'm interested in us disrupting or thinking more carefully about, even how in a lot of natural history museums, the dioramas, for example, don't necessarily credit the painters of the backgrounds or the sculptors and modelers who made the works or the date of their creation. They give you a lot of information about the scene you're seeing and the species you're seeing, but it's presented as though this is an exact copy of this place, and it's so exact you don't need to know anything more about it. It's just objective, right? So I was thinking about the ways in which that labor is so skilled and so convincing that it erases any signs of itself in that way. In terms of resistance, I was also thinking about Leopold Blaschka's writing about glass in particular as being a kind of reluctant collaborator. You heat glass until it becomes kind of like honey, molten and movable. But he said, he wrote about it being a very temperamental thing. If you try to rush it, it will break or not collaborate with you, and then that mistake will be fixed forever. And so this kind of battle between the creator and the medium, and the battle with time, both in terms of the thing itself, the blossom fading in front of you, and your attempt to fix something forever. So I went big and then I went very specific. Let me bring back out to, yeah, Kristoffer, I loved your paper. Thanks.
I'm not sure if this will answer your question, but one of the things that drew me to Wallace Craig's work is that he knew how unique what he was trying to do was, and how against the grain of a lot of ornithology what he was doing was, and was very generous, sort of the opposite of what you're describing, Ellery. He was very generous with acknowledging the labor of others. Over and over in his correspondence, he asks many of these people sending him their recordings of birdsong, would you like to be a co-author on this? And he, it's not unusual in the history of ornithology to see somebody collect information or dead birds or banding information from a large network of amateur collaborators. But Craig knew that what he was asking people to do was quite unusual, and that the results, this sort of multi-person, hundreds of thousands of recordings, statistical analysis of a single species song was very unusual. And it took him, as I mentioned, over 15 years. So he had obviously a lot of things to push against, to be able to collect all this information, but never did he try to like cover up the sources of this work. He was always if you read the monograph itself, he's very he expresses his thanks for all these collaborators repeatedly, and none of them, maybe to their credit, I don't know, took him up on being co-authors. They voluntarily woke up at 3 a.m. to trudge through the woods and write down what they heard these birds doing.
I was thinking a lot about absence in all of these presentations, and certainly the kind of ephemeral nature of birdsong and documenting that. And for die charts, the intangible cultural teachings and values that are such an important part of their production, but sort of absent from the actual representation. But I became interested in die charts because I now live in Santa Fe and you see them all over. But most people had no idea what the original, like their history and the original contexts of their production and circulation. And so I think for me, it became a story about the kind of historical slippages that occur when we're telling these histories. There's a lot more I could say about it, but I'll stop for now.
I'll say, just to respond quickly to your responses, and then we'll open it up. I think one of the things that really struck me particularly about your paper, Kristoffer, is this method of nonviolent collecting, and I think in some ways your work is pushing back against this older tradition of salvage anthropology, which certainly is violent, and also I think your example, Julia, of showing women's mobility, and so there's kind of this freedom in all of the stories that you're telling, so that's pushing back against some of the more maybe problematic or troubled histories of natural history. So I'm happy to take questions from other folks if there are any. I think we have one over here. If you want to come on up here to the microphone, or we can bring the microphone to you. I think you have to hold it for a second. It's on? Okay.
Hi. Kristoffer, I have a question for you. Have you had a chance to get out in the field and get, study these wood pewees for yourself? Just sort of taking a a little tip from Julia's getting her hands wet in the seaweed world. What have you learned about the wood pewee, and do you think there's something that you could contribute to the natural history of the wood pewee, having studied Wallace Craig's work?
So my first project as a historian of science sort of centered a shorebird, a threatened shorebird. And at the conclusion of that project, I was never going to study birds again. But but then I stumbled on Wallace Craig, and I've never woken up at 3 a.m. to go out in the woods and listen to a wood pewee. Although now that you ask, I'm tempted. So my interaction with Wallace Craig is more with Wallace Craig, and what I know about wood pewees comes from like the Cornell Lab of O's website, which I did go on. I was going to actually click a link and play the song for you all, but then I didn't know if that would work, so I skipped it. But having heard the song now I can identify it if I go out. But I think the larger point you're making is I should really know more about pewees, and I agree.
Bob is coming, I think, slowly down the aisle.
I was just going to say, it's so poignant for someone focused on birdsong to be losing his hearing, and just that was really moving, a really moving part of your paper.
Yeah, it's the correspondence is a little hard to read in the sense that he's telling everyone he writes back and forth with, really bemoaning his hearing loss, and not just you don't see him writing about missing hearing birds so much as not having access to the institutional support and students and all the things he had before to help him. So yeah, the correspondence is difficult to read in that sense.
I first started to think about a question for Ellery Foutch, which is, how do these guys do it? In the sense that if you're going to copy something in such exquisite detail, and plants don't last forever, how do they actually go from the living things to these glass models? And then how does anybody now have the skill, or does anybody else do that kind of exceptionally detailed work in glass? But then I thought about the first three of you speakers, and I wanted to ask a broader question, which is anybody else, or do people now do the kind of work that you've described, collecting seaweed and creating albums, other than you, of course, and collecting thousands of bird songs in order to really document what the repertoire is, I guess. So I'll leave it at that. You can say whatever you wish.
I'll do a mini answer and then open it out again. Yes, the lamp working is lamp working is fairly difficult. I've tried my hand at it at a Corning Museum of Glass workshop and failed miserably, made very many clumpy looking things. But very skilled glass artisans have reconstructed these tables and the tables that the Blaschkas used, and have tried to re-imitate the technique, in some instances threading wire through the glass when it's hot to create like the spikes of a cactus, for example. But there's some great videos online from the Corning Museum of Glass of very advanced lamp workers doing this kind of technique. But yeah, I think the distance from the actual thing is what makes people so interested in and curious about the making of the objects. So
I think definitely there are a few people who are bringing back seaweed enthusiasm. I think particularly in a kind of like coastal New England context when there's also the kind of idea of memory that I was talking about in my presentation is particularly, I think, potent for those artists. But I think also what I would add to this question is the fact that I think we're kind of in a seaweed moment again, to an extent, which, yeah, it's kind of, I mean, at least in terms of diet, there's, it's very trendy right now to eat sea moss. This is like a trend on social media that has taken place in recent years amongst some celebrities who go to fancy grocery stores in LA. So if you would like to add a scoop of sea moss to your smoothie, this is possible at times. And I think in general, I mean, this is kind of a joke, but in general, I think people are attentive to seaweed in a different way, also in kinds of like conservation efforts. And I mean, yeah, in terms of cuisine and makeup. So anyway, seaweed moment. Now you'll notice seaweed everywhere, I suppose.
To answer that question, yeah, lots of people go out and record birds. And record bird songs, and it's only gotten, I guess you could argue it's become more of a citizen science kind of thing now to go out. You can record a bird on your phone, the phone will identify it, upload it to eBird, all these things. I think what makes Wallace Craig unique is that it was collaborative, but also he was of a moment in comparative psychology where analyzing bird vocalizations as songs and what that could tell us about the interior lives of animals. That's quite different than what your average bird song collector is out there doing today, I would argue.
Oh, I think we have a question actually here.
Thank you for these fantastic presentations. I really enjoyed them all. Each of you kind of gave us a lens of a particular individual kind of examining these natural history specimens. And, maybe that has to do with format. And in only one case, I think we had the vision that Kristoffer offered of the genius human kind of searching for the genius bird. So I wondered just if you could all talk a little bit about what is to be lost and gained by examining this kind of lens of natural history through individual human agency specifically.
I was just going to say that I think the myth of objectivity still needs some exploding in terms of representations of science, and all of the material we're analyzing is created and mediated through other human subjectivities. And so in some ways I have a hard time imagining separating the lives of the makers or the personal dispositions and obsessions of the makers from that. But that maybe, I don't know that that got at the heart of your question. So I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, I mean, something I would add to this on the question of individuality is just the fact that I've looked at a number of albums in collections around the Northeast and hopefully in the UK this summer. But very, very few of them have actually been attributed to a particular person. And many examples are unknown makers. And even the fact that, the maker was perhaps a woman is something that I am surmising based on what I know about who had access to this kind of art. And so I think, I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of, I think what Hadley was speaking about with absence also, where on the one hand, I think this was a very popular phenomenon that women of a particular class had access to. But then on the other hand, so much of what I'm arguing is about, a person going to a place and saying, I went here. And yet at the same time, I don't know who that person was really. I just kind of know where they went and what seaweed they might have found there. So it's a kind of interesting balance, I would say.
I do think it is problematic potentially to focus on a genius individual looking for a genius bird. I think that birds are cute. What I'm interested in is whether or not and how we might apply more contemporary ideas like disability gain to historical methodologies and resources. And for me, what's important about Wallace Craig is that he left any historical trace at all that we can use and try to understand. He doesn't have an archive. His correspondence is sprinkled throughout a bunch of archives, including the APS, because he died almost completely forgotten. In fact, one of the leading ethologists at the time, Wallace Craig, attended one of his lectures in the late 40s, and when he was told that, he said, "I thought Craig had died." So I consider myself lucky to have found any of this correspondence at all. And since we're thanking laborers, I should take this opportunity to thank the people, the other historians who sent me their correspondence that they had of Craig's, because otherwise I would have very much less than I do. So that for me, this is a way to, even though it's one individual, it's a way to give voice to different groups of people that we very rarely get to see preserved historical sources for.
I think for die charts, it's expanded in so many different directions. And I think there's value in recovering these individual stories, because like I had learned that Mabel Burnside Myers originally created die charts in a card format that younger weavers could carry around to weaving classes. And then they wanted something that they could hang on their walls. And so they became this framed object that then took on a different kind of history with non-native consumers. But then I learned that Mabel Burnside Myers was not only a weaver, but a weaving demonstrator at the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco. And she was also a contributor to the first book on Navajo dyes in the 1940s, which is sort of an obscure publication, but it's just revealed so many different kind of overlooked histories that has really informed my research, my curatorial projects. So yeah.
So I think with that, we're going to bring this session to a close, and we'll come back in about 15 minutes and have a sneak peek into some of the Academy collections, which you'll also get to see after the final session. But for now, please join me in thanking this group of panelists for really spectacular.